Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to lesson 6. I'm just getting my screen going here of the whole farm discussion. And today I want to talk about more details about crop livestock integration. So let's get right into it. The progression of crops and livestock throughout history is quite interesting. If we look at the left-hand side of this figure, we really are describing the farming system of 500 years ago in Europe, where crops and livestock were separate. The livestock were on the common lands. And then in the 1800s, livestock started becoming part of the actual crop rotation through the Norfolk 4-course crop rotation and then the 7-year crop rotation. And that system was very successful, and it allowed the population in Europe to increase. But time marches on, and with especially the development of Haber-Bosch nitrogen fertilizer, the system was uncoupled again, and farmers were able to focus on grains and fertilize the soil with nitrogen fertilizer, and you had a separation of the crop livestock integration. And that's really where we find ourselves today. We have a lot of specialized grain production and a lot of specialized livestock production. But not all is lost. In organic agriculture, we know that when we combine the crops and the livestock, whether on a local level through on-farm integration, or whether on an area-wide integration, where we maybe have manure from a livestock operation be shipped to an organic grain operation, we can combine crops and livestock. And so there's a lot of enthusiasm for reintegrating crops and livestock. And we wrote a paper in 2007 on this called Reconsidering Crop Livestock Integration in North America. And I wrote it with 2 American colleagues. And, you know, that paper has received a lot of attention as people look to deal with the challenges of both specialized crop and specialized livestock production. But it's especially important in organic production. And I just want to share an example from the Beaton farm just north of Winnipeg. Thank you to Scott for these 2 slides. And so Scott Beaton and his family have an organic farm, and they have been grazing cow-calf pairs as a way of making their green manure legume more profitable. And so Scott has invested in the livestock part of the farm, both with housing and also using a pasture pipeline, not only to water the livestock, but also to irrigate the pasture. So crop livestock integration is alive and well, and especially critical in organic agriculture. So in this program, we've talked about mind maps, and this is a mind map that we came up with for an organic crop livestock system. So it shows the major components of the organic crop livestock. And it's got different features. I'll go through them quickly. We've got the animal in the middle, and we're grazing the animal on pasture, on perennial pasture. That is the cheapest way to graze, to feed ruminants, is have them grazing on perennial pastures. And so we can consider what species to add. We can have grazing management that's superior, that utilizes that pasture more efficiently and profitably. And we have to be aware of things like pathogens, especially with sheep. So that's one way to feed the animals. And these perennial pastures might be in rotation with grain crops. And of course, that's something that we're really interested in organic production. But let's just hang on to that thought for a second. The animals are also getting other feed supplements and things like grain legumes for protein. If they're pigs, they definitely need protein. If they're poultry, chicory for parasite control in ruminants, and maybe the chicory is actually grown in the pasture and the animals graze it. We have to think of the animal health, and there's all kinds of approaches like isothiocyanates to improve gut health of animals. And then animal welfare, access to the outdoors, no nose ringing and that type of thing are also need to be considered. And then the animals produce manure, and that goes on the cropland, and that's really useful. And the animals produce other services to the crop rotation. For example, if the crop is weedy and cannot be used for a grain crop, it could be cut for silage or hay and fed to the animals if they're ruminants, or even if they're pigs. And these livestock services, I think, is something that we've not thought about enough. And I mentioned pigs, for example. Sows love alfalfa. Pigs are omnivores, and I eat salad, I eat broccoli. Why can't pigs do that? And they do very, very well. If you want to learn more about that, go to 3Gen Organics and learn about organic pig production. Okay, so that's the sort of the crop livestock ecosystem. Now let's focus on the crop rotation part of it. One of the standbys in organic crop livestock production is to include a forage legume in the rotation. And this next slide shows all of the field sites where there's either an ongoing study or there has been long-term studies looking at the role of forages in grain-based cropping systems. And I'm just going to give you one example from northern Alberta. And what they've done here is they had a bunch of land uses, multi-year alfalfa, alfalfa brome, red fescue, and then a rotation where they had wheat fallow. So they grew the wheat after these crops or after something that had been fallowed for a long time. And what they monitored was the yield of the wheat in year 1, 2, 4, and 5 after they broke up the forages. I don't know what happened to year 3. And the data is pretty striking that the alfalfa results in the highest yield even 5 years after the alfalfa breaking compared to a wheat fallow system. And that just demonstrates the value of that alfalfa in rotation. So if a crop livestock system is growing alfalfa to feed the livestock and you break up that alfalfa and plant your grains, you get a real yield boost. And the data here show, we don't know what happened in year 3, but years 1 and 2 after forage breaking give us the biggest boost. And I would say year 3, other data shows that year 3 does pretty well. So the way to organize a rotation is to grow 2 or 3 extractive crops after you break up the alfalfa or the alfalfa brome. Now, as far as pure grasses, it's not really something that organic farmers want to grow unless they're producing high value seed, because these grasses add no nitrogen. And so that's a bit of a challenge. The only time you might be faced with growing grasses alone is if you have salinity and you have to grow something like intermediate wheatgrass or another salt-tolerant grass. Now, another option, like the one I showed you from Scott Beaton's farm, is you could graze the green manure as a way of improving the economics of that green manure. And questions come up sometimes is, what's the best way to graze the green manure? And then what about weeds in the green manure, especially Canada thistle, which is a real problem weed in organic production. We know that if we till that, we're going to get good control of it. What kind of control do we get with grazing? And I'm not going to lie, beef cattle are not going to eliminate the Canada thistle. They will suppress it. And if you have a patch of Canada thistle, you might put a bale, a small round bale here or something to get the animals to trample this. But that's difficult if the thistle is spread across the whole field. Mixing sheep in with the beef animals will definitely improve the Canada thistle control, and then goats will do even more damage to the thistle. So we've talked about nitrogen. So in this mind map or ecosystem of a crop livestock system, sources of nitrogen are legumes in rotation, like green manures that we graze, or legumes in the pasture or the hay fields. Before we get to phosphorus, let me just say that one of the reactions that my students have in the organic course is they go like, I'm really looking forward to organics. I'm going to add my nutrients with manure, and then I'm going to grow these great crops. And I tell them that, well, unless you have a very small land base or you have access to a lot of manure, it's going to be far too expensive for you to supply your nitrogen with the manure. We have to grow the nitrogen with legumes. That's just the reality on most larger organic farms. Of course, we do want to import other nutrients through manure. And I've shown here sources of phosphorus would be feed supplements, imported forage, or imported manure. But we want to apply that phosphorus at a rate that the crop needs. And that would mean that the nitrogen rate from the manure would be far too low to grow most crops. You'll get a little bit of nitrogen with the manure, but manure is precious. And on large farms, it's usually only added for its phosphorus or micronutrient or potassium contribution. So we can also get scientific about this, and I think it's really important to get scientific. Basically, we got the crop rotation here on the left now, and what I'm trying to depict here is that if we have a phosphorus deficiency in our pasture, and we use that phosphorus to feed livestock, that manure is also going to be phosphorus deficient. And that means we're going to have to use a higher rate of that manure on our fields. So by becoming scientific about it, what we need to do is know the nutrient status of the soil. We need to know the nutrient status of the pasture plants, and we need to know the nutrient status of the manure. So that is really important. Getting manure tested, getting your feed tested, and getting your soil tested. I really want to stress that. And that allows you to take a scientific approach. And the cost is pretty minimal. And the good news is it's a lot easier to sample a manure pile than it is to sample a whole field. So that's something about the ecosystem of crops and livestock. I want to come back to this forage part of the rotation because forages are really important to the health of an organic farming operation. And let me start by talking about forages and the soil. So this is a complicated diagram. On the right is a picture of a tour bus and a bunch of participants in Uruguay. Uruguay is a country about halfway down South America. This is the size of the country. And this is the location here at La Estanzuela, where I've had the privilege of working. And this is home to the longest running crop rotation study in South America. And they started it in the late 50s, and they compared two farming systems, a continuous grain system. So this is a subtropical region, so they grow 3 crops in 2 years. And then a forage-based system, where the rotations are 8-year rotations, and the forage-based rotation has 4 years of forage and then 4 years of grain. And the continuous grain system is only ever grains. And what they were measuring here, I took this picture from a poster on the wall at the center, and they were showing the legume dry matter. You could see the bottom bars here. You know, you've got your 4 years of forage, and you've got your legume dry matter. And here they're showing the soil organic matter. And excuse me, like many places in the Western Hemisphere, agriculture is quite young, and so organic matter levels are quite high, at least compared to a lot of places in, let's say, the Middle East, where people have been farming for thousands of years, or Europe, where they've been farming for 1,000 years or more. And so what they found is with continuous grain production, the organic matter was continuing to drop. And that's very typical. With the forage-based system, you can see by the end of the 30 years, the organic matter was higher. And you can also see that it went up every time they included the 4 years of forage. You see it going up, then they grow 4 grain crops, it goes down, goes back up, and it varies depending on the seasons and how much crop biomass is produced and how many roots are produced. By the way, we also cored this rotation and went down to about 3 feet and found more carbon deeper in the soil where we had the forage-based rotation versus the continuous grain. So this is a really important fact, is that when you put perennial forages in a rotation, even in that short period of time, you're going to boost the organic matter. And so organic farming is sometimes criticized for using tillage. Tillage is not all bad, that's dogma. But by putting a multi-year forage crop, you definitely are giving the soil a chance to heal and bring back its organic matter. Now, one of the things about this study, even though Uruguay has lots of grazing, there is no grazing in this study. They simulate the grazing by cutting the forage. So I want to show you a data set where Alan Franzlubers and their colleagues in Georgia also grew a forage cover crop for 5 years. Well, actually, this data set shows them going all the way to 8 years after they've established a Bermuda grass pasture. And they were interested in how different management of that forage would affect the soil organic carbon or the soil organic matter. And what they found is when they cut that Bermuda grass for hay, the organic matter didn't really change over 8 years. Where they left the Bermuda grass unharvested, the organic matter went up relative to where they cut it for hay. And this makes perfect sense, right? They cut the hay, they didn't bring manure back. And here they left it just growing every year. It just dropped its carbon on the soil. But what was really surprising is that when they grazed that Bermuda grass pasture, they actually got higher organic matter, either at low grazing pressure or at higher grazing pressure. So something about the grazing animal increased the soil carbon. And when I first became aware of this, I had a lot of questions, like how can that possibly happen? And now I know that if you don't overgraze, when the animal tugs on the plant, when beef cattle or dairy cows tug on the plant, it actually pulls a lot of the root hairs off the root, and that carbon is very quickly incorporated into soil organic matter by the bacteria. And so what they found is that the rate of carbon sequestration was actually highest where the crop was grazed, and it was twice as high as where it was left unharvested. And if I think about this for 5 seconds, I realize, well, this is how the prairie evolved, right? With grazing animals, with bison and pronghorn antelope and other ruminants. And so it really shows the importance of the crop livestock integration for soil health. Now, one of the other nice things about perennials is they have deep roots. And this is some work we did a long time ago in Manitoba. And we had a field that had been subject to a lot of summer fallow. It was a high organic matter soil, and a lot of the nitrogen had leached deep into the soil. And so it was a great opportunity to find out how long it would take alfalfa to go get that nitrogen. And you might be thinking, how is this possible? Alfalfa is a legume, and now it's, how can it take up nitrogen if it fixes its own nitrogen? Well, plants are going to use the most readily available nitrogen source. And if nitrogen is in the soil, the alfalfa is going to use it. Doesn't mean it's not going to fix, but it's going to use that nitrogen. And what we found is that in year 1, 2, 3, and 4 years of the stand, you can see how effectively that alfalfa used the nitrogen down to 300 centimeters. You know, here we're at 5 feet, so or deeper. So it's a very effective way of extracting that. Now, those deep roots of the perennials can also help when we have wet soil conditions. We talk a lot about drought, and things have been dry for the last 7 years, but we also run into periods where they're really wet, and the deep roots of things like alfalfa can really help improve the internal drainage of the soil. And this is Curtis Cavers, who as a very young man did his master's on looking at how alfalfa in rotation affects hydraulic conductivity. And those deep roots also allow us to manage salinity. And here's a plot from near Swift Current where there's experiments to find out which grasses are most saline tolerant. And of course, if we are observant on the dryland prairie, we see evidence of salinity, and the kochia patches in the grain are a dead giveaway. And this area here needs perennials to manage the water, which will then manage the salt. Early in my work at the University of Manitoba, I was really interested in how forages would affect yield. So I created a survey, and 253 farmers responded back right at the beginning of my career here. These are all the dots where the farms were located. And 67% of the farmers said they had a yield benefit after forages compared to where crop followed just in an annual rotation. So this really supports that Ag Canada data from Northern Alberta, which showed that alfalfa in the rotation it increases yields. And so we set up a little experiment to look at that. And here is continuous wheat for 7 years, I believe. The back half receives fertilizer, the front half doesn't. And so you can put this in your mind's eye. And here we've got a treatment where we actually had 6 years of alfalfa, and this is the third wheat crop. And you can see it's better both where it was fertilized and where it was not. And this just illustrates the benefit of alfalfa in rotation. And then, you know, here's just another illustration of a rotation that is only grains, wheat, pea, wheat, flax. This is the 8th year of this study at Glenlee. And we had 21.9 bushels of flax when we added pesticides and fertilizer. And here we have a rotation of 2 years of alfalfa, flax, and wheat in the 8th year, exactly the same yield with no external inputs. So alfalfa in rotation does a very good job of increasing yield potential. Part of the reason is the nitrogen. The other part is forages help control weeds. Now, I talk a lot to myself when I'm walking across the fields, and I'm talking to you now about Canada thistle. Because Canada thistle is a real problem in organic production, and it has driven some farmers to abandon certain fields or perhaps even their whole organic operation. Adding alfalfa hay crops into the rotation does a great job of controlling Canada thistle. And the way it does it is it forces the thistle plants to compete with the perennial alfalfa in the springtime. And then because the thistle is looking for light, and then you cut it off with the swather or the hay bind, and you have depleted a lot of the root reserves. And you do that, 5 to 7 times over a couple of 3-4 years, you will massively deplete the thistle. And if we look at thistle growing in a grain crop, it's not having to elongate at the same time of year, which means it's not tapping into its root reserves. It's going to be much harder to deplete. And we did a study at Glenlee years ago where we went into 3 cropping systems that had thistle patches in them. So We had our grain-only rotation, so we were looking for a cropping system that was wheat, and the previous years it had been peas. And we dug out the thistle roots from sort of 1 cubic foot of soil, maybe a bit more. And we measured, we had 0.4 tons per hectare of thistle root biomass, dry biomass. Where we had alfalfa for 2 years, we had 0.15. We had 75% less thistle roots. And where we grew no crop, we had 1 ton. So by growing crops, we reduce the thistles by half, but by growing forages, we reduce it by about 85% compared to doing nothing. And the alfalfa roots were about 4.4 tons in that same zone. So tons per hectare. And this has been confirmed by other organic researchers. Here's work of Pat Carr and colleagues at Montana State University, and they looked at different ways of controlling thistle. And here we have organic alfalfa, 2017. You can see the yellow line. The thistle density is very low. Where they just use tillage, you can see where they used a lot of tillage, it's about the same, but where they were using growing just grain crops or reducing their tillage, you can see the thistle populations went up. Grazing was not as effective as haying for thistle. So this is a very important support for the work that we've seen. So when we're talking about the crop livestock integration, let's take this thing out for a real test drive. And so this is a picture on the bottom left from Brazil, and they're doing strip cropping with agroforestry. And this got us thinking, what about if we put animals in these strips and had them graze while we were growing this timber, and then moved them into the cropland and had them spend the night and transfer the nutrients from the tree line into the field? This is called nighttime corralling, and it's done in many parts of the world, especially West Africa. It's very, very popular, where people who have grain farms will invite the nomadic herders onto their farm, have the animals spend a night, drop some nutrients, and move on. And we've done experiments to look at the amount of nutrient transfer, and it's not insignificant. I mean, it's a crazy idea, but the notion is that we want the animals to provide some unique services, and we want to do it without burning a lot of diesel fuel. We want the animals to move those nutrients themselves. So the model I've drawn here on the right has a tree line with deep-rooted trees and shrubs. Of course, birds will come into those and drop more nutrients, and then animals can graze in there and then nighttime corral on the fields. I know it's a crazy idea, but I'll take credit for a crazy idea. The nice thing also about having these trees is they're going to lift micronutrients from very deep in the soil, potassium, sulfur as well, and and phosphorus. So it also follows the philosophy that if we're going to have animals in agriculture, they must do some work. Animals have 4 legs. They can walk around. They don't need to be trailered everywhere. And this concept is alive and well in different parts of the world. So for example, this is on a research station in India where they have the chicken coop above the pond. And in the pond are tilapia fish. And the tilapia fish will eat the chicken poop. And yes, there's algae and E. coli in here, but that does not bother the tilapia, nor does it affect the tilapia meat. And so this is a form of livestock integration with the algae, which is essentially a plant, and the fish. And we can even get more sophisticated. And let me give you another example of crop livestock integration. This is for the tropics, but it could be adapted anywhere. So we've got rice, pulses, and corn feeding goats. The goats are in this barn above the fish pond. The chickens can also be above the fish pond. The goats do their business, drop their nutrients into the into the water. That causes duckweed and things to grow. Well, you can feed the duck and the goat droppings and the chicken droppings are eaten by the tilapia, and they become food. So you're producing grains, you're producing goat milk or meat, you're producing duck meat, maybe eggs and tilapia. And some of the grain goes to dairy animals, and that manure goes into a biodigester, which goes into these vermicomposting things that worms are used to compost. And maybe some of the water from the tilapia pond flows through here as well to feed that system with moisture. So these are the kinds of integrated crop livestock systems which actually exist around the world. How can we mimic these in our context where we are? So to try to illustrate this, just in my own little mind, I think, why don't we have a Netflix series on this? So I've constructed a little Netflix story and allowing the animals themselves to tell the story. So thanks for humoring me. Let's get going. The season opener is called This Old Prairie, and it basically focuses on perennial plants. And this is a picture from Weaver from Nebraska showing the depth of all these native plants going down 7 meters. That's over 20 feet deep. That's the season opener. And we illustrate the value of these perennials by visiting different grass-fed farms in Manitoba growing grass-fed beef, and in Ontario growing grass-fed milk and producing organic meadow grass-fed butter. Now, one of the things the viewers in episode 1 will be really excited about is to learn that when ruminants are fed grasses or herbaceous plants, they actually produce milk and meat, which is healthier for us. It's healthier for our cardiovascular system, our heart, our immune system. This is very well documented in the literature. So this will get people running to the store for grass-fed milk. So the shift from grains to forage for ruminant production will have human and environmental benefits. Okay, episode 2 is called the Rhizobium bacteria affair. So it's I know this is goofy. So here the farmer is worried, checking their cell phone about the price of nitrogen, wanting to import some kind of expensive organic nitrogen source, and the cattle say, stop checking the internet, we got this, just grow green manures, we'll graze them, we'll make your nitrogen with the help of these bacteria. So that's a very exciting episode. Episode 3 is called Pigs in Space. Who, me? What do I mean by pigs in space? Sorry, I'm in my space. The pigs are outside. Really? You can have pigs outside? That is a space that's suitable for pigs? I thought pigs only could be raised in barns. Well, pigs do a great job of being outside, and they till the soil with their snouts. That not only helps reduce diesel fuel costs, it makes the pig much happier. And a happier animal gains more weight, is healthier, needs less medicine. And so Terry Miro here on the right, organic farmer in southern Manitoba, was grazing pigs and then selecting potato varieties that went on the land that the pigs had grazed. So in the background, you can see the pigs on a patch of land with an electric fence around there, and that's going to be a potato crop next year. So pigs in space. Episode 4 is called Diesel or Me. Diesel, you'll all recognize diesel on the left, is used to turn compost. And making compost is fantastic. It's great for organic production, but it costs a lot of diesel fuel. The pig said, hey, I got this. And this really drilled home to me when I went to an organic farm in Germany, and they had a beautiful long winter housing shed for their cattle, and they put straw in this barn, and the straw pack just grew and grew all winter. And then they let the pigs, the beef cattle out in the springtime. And during the winter, they had thrown corn seed into the manure pack, and it fermented in the straw. And after the cattle went out, they let the pigs in there, and the pigs turned all that straw because they were going for their fermented corn. And so they composted without diesel fuel. So episode 4, Diesel or Me. Episode 5 is called Great Bags of Fire. And this is something that impressed me in Costa Rica. We were visiting this farm, Ricardo's farm, and they had this biodigester, basically a silage bag, using the manure from their 12 animals, and they produced methane, which they used to boil their milk in their cheese-making operation. And I'm happy to say that we now have biodigesters in Canada, and they not only produce electricity, they also produce digestate, which is an organic fertilizer. Here's two dogs going, this dog park is boring. I mean, dogs, what do dogs like to do? I have a dog, and my dog likes to sniff everything. He's got a great nose. Dogs can smell 1,000 times better than humans, and pigs can smell even better than that. And at the Honig Vineyard and Winery in California, they use these dogs to detect mealybugs. So the one dog is saying, anyone for kicking some mealybug butt? And the other dog says, you butt. And we went to California to my brother-in-law's wedding, and my wife arranged for us to visit this vineyard. It's organic. And we met the dogs that go up and down the rows. And when they smell a mealybug in a grape plant, they stop and bark, and that plant gets removed, as opposed to adding pesticides. So, wow, the animals can do all kinds of things. And this is a story from the Western, or it was in one of the farm newspapers, where dogs are used to look at blackleg in canola. So this Netflix series is going to be a hit, and it's going to allow me to fund my whole research program. So that brings me to the end of our crop livestock integrated session. I'd like to dedicate it to all who do agriculture in whatever way you do that work. And I'd like to thank you for your attention and for humoring my probably not get rich Netflix scheme. Take care. Have a nice day.